When the system fails, who stands up for the truth? Explore the gripping tales of those who took justice into their own hands and changed the rules of the game. Hit that subscribe button and witness the power of true conviction.
My manager folded his hands on the table, that practiced smile spreading across his face like he'd rehearsed it in the bathroom mirror that morning. "Sarah, your contributions to this team have been nothing short of remarkable," he said, leaning back in his ergonomic chair, the one the company bought after I landed the Hargrove Technologies account. "But we've decided to move forward with Marcus for the VP of Product Strategy role. He brings a certain energy to the table, a vision for where this industry is headed." I kept my expression exactly where I needed it. Neutral, composed, the face of a woman receiving difficult news with professionalism and grace. I nodded slowly, reached into my portfolio, and slid a single folder across his desk. "I understand," I said. "I put together something for you to review when you have a moment." He glanced down at it, brow furrowing with the first flicker of uncertainty I'd seen all morning. "What is this?" I was already standing. "Just some paperwork. The second page will need your signature." I left before he could open it. 7 years at Pinnacle Growth Partners had taught me one thing, above all else. The people who get ahead are rarely the people who deserve to. That's not bitterness. That's data. And I had more data on this company than anyone in that building, including my manager. The folder on his desk contained my formal resignation letter, effective immediately per the terms outlined in Section 9 of my employment agreement, covering repeated promotional discrimination. Beneath it, on crisp ivory letterhead, sat a signed service contract between Hargrove Technologies and a firm called Clarion Advisors. My firm. And Hargrove, with its $11 million annual consulting budget, had agreed to come with me. His assistant called my cell before I reached the elevator. I let it ring. Understanding how I got to that moment requires going back further than most people would expect. Not to the morning Marcus walked in and started charming his way up the ladder. Not even to the first time my work appeared in someone else's presentation deck, with someone else's name on it. It goes back to a Tuesday afternoon 3 years earlier, when our largest client pulled me aside after a quarterly review and said something that cracked the foundation of everything I thought I understood about this industry. His name was Glenn Hargrove. He'd built his company from a regional distribution firm into a national logistics platform, and he was exactly the kind of client that consulting firms put in their brochures. When he asked to speak with me privately after the meeting, I assumed he was going to negotiate our rates down again. Instead, he sat across from me in a small conference room, loosened his tie, and said, "Sarah, I'm going to be direct with you because I think you can handle it. I've been paying your firm $460,000 a year for 3 years. And when my board asks me what we've gotten for that, I'm not sure I can answer them anymore." I started to explain the scope of deliverables, the strategic roadmaps, the implementation support. He held up one hand. "That's not the problem," he said. "The problem is that your firm gets paid whether I grow or not. Your incentive is to keep me engaged, not to actually move the needle. You bill hours. I need outcomes." I drove home that night with his words sitting in my chest like a stone. Because he was right. He was completely right. And the worst part was that I had known it, somewhere quiet and professional, for a long time. I just never said it out loud. That night I opened a new document on my personal laptop and started writing. Not a memo, not a strategy deck. Just thinking. What would a consulting engagement look like if the firm only got paid when the client actually won? What would pricing look like if it was tied to measurable growth, not hours logged? I worked until 2 in the morning, then closed the laptop and told myself it was an interesting thought experiment. I didn't touch it again for 6 weeks. But it came back to me every time I watched a junior associate stretch a 2-week deliverable into 5. Every time I sat in a billing review meeting and heard partners celebrate how many hours they'd captured on a single client. Every time Glenn's board member's face appeared in my memory, politely skeptical, waiting for an answer I hadn't been able to give. The idea grew slowly. The way serious ideas do. I started keeping notes. I documented client frustrations, comments made in passing during calls, feedback buried in satisfaction surveys that nobody at Pinnacle seemed to read carefully. I built a spreadsheet that tracked what clients said they needed versus what they were actually receiving. The gap was staggering. I said nothing to anyone, not yet. The moment everything accelerated came on a Thursday in early October. My manager held a team meeting to announce promotions, and 3 names were called. Mine wasn't among them. The person promoted to senior strategy director was a man named Derek, who had been at the firm for 2 years less than me, and whose biggest account, which I happened to know intimately because I had helped him through every major deliverable, had renewed only because I personally intervened when the relationship nearly collapsed. After the meeting, I walked back to my desk and sat for a moment looking at the Chicago skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Then I opened my personal laptop, retrieved the document I'd been building for 6 months, and started writing with a focus I hadn't felt in years. I incorporated Clarion advisors the following month. I chose the name deliberately. Clarion, clear, sharp, unmistakable. Everything Pinnacle was not. What I needed next was a financial architect. Someone who understood how to structure a firm that operated on an entirely different model than everything currently in the market. I found her exactly where I should have thought to look first. Patricia Wynn had been Pinnacle's chief financial officer for 19 years. She was 61, wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and had a reputation for being the most rigorous financial thinker in the building. She was also, I had learned over 3 years of budget meetings, deeply tired of watching the firm prioritize margin over meaning. We had never been close in a personal sense. Our relationship was professional, efficient, occasionally sharp, but I respected her, and I had reason to believe the respect ran both ways. I asked her to coffee under the pretense of discussing a financial modeling question for a client proposal. We met at a bakery 2 blocks from the office on a gray Wednesday morning. I told her what I was building. I expected pushback. What I got was something closer to relief. I've run the numbers on this model 3 times in the last decade, she said, wrapping her hands around her mug. Every time they work, the industry just doesn't want to change because the people at the top are winning the current game. She looked at me over her glasses. I'm retiring in 4 months. What do you need from me? What followed was the most intensive period of planning in my professional life. Patricia helped me build a financial structure that was both revolutionary and defensible. Fixed engagement fees tied to clearly defined milestones. Performance bonuses activated only when client metrics hit agreed targets. A pricing model with tiered options so companies at different stages could access the same quality of thinking. She brought decades of hard-won knowledge to problems I hadn't even known to anticipate. Things like cash flow timing, liability exposure, the specific language in contracts that protected us without alienating clients. We met twice a week in my apartment. My dining table disappeared under spreadsheets, legal pads, and laptop cables. Patricia became the financial backbone of everything I was building, and gradually, carefully, I began to build the rest of the team. I had spent years watching who was actually doing the work at the firms around me, the people whose names appeared in the footnotes, never the headlines, the people who had quietly brilliant ideas that got absorbed into someone else's presentation. I knew them. I had been them. The first person I approached was a woman named Dominique, a client engagement specialist at a competitor firm who I had met at a technology summit the previous spring. She was meticulous, client-focused to a degree her own firm seemed to regard as a liability, and had mentioned more than once in our conversations that she was tired of measuring her success in billable increments, rather than actual results. I invited her to lunch and asked her directly. She said yes before the food arrived. Then came James, a data strategist I had worked alongside on a cross-firm project 2 years earlier. He had developed a proprietary assessment framework that his firm had adopted without credit or compensation. When I explained our model, he was quiet for a long moment, then asked to see the financial projections. He reviewed them for 3 days and called me on a Sunday morning to say he was in. I added 2 more over the following months. Each conversation was careful. Each was conducted off company property, through personal accounts, without a single resource belonging to Pinnacle. I had read my employment contract so many times I could recite the relevant sections in my sleep. I was not going to hand anyone a reason to come after me. The hardest part wasn't the planning. It wasn't even the fear, though there was fear, plenty of it. In the quiet hours after everyone else had gone home, and I sat alone on the small balcony of my apartment, looking at the city and asking myself whether I was being courageous or reckless. The hardest part was the duplicity required to perform perfectly at Pinnacle while building something designed to replace it. Every client meeting, every internal review, every performance evaluation. I showed up fully, delivered completely, and revealed nothing. Not because I owed Pinnacle my loyalty at that point, but because my exit needed to be clean. Everything I built at that firm was going to be transferred according to protocol, organized for whoever came after me, documented without gaps. I would leave nothing for anyone to attack. The conversation with Glenn Hargrove happened 6 months before I resigned. I had spent considerable time thinking about how to approach it, whether to approach it at all. My employment agreement prohibited me from soliciting Pinnacle clients while still employed. I reviewed that language 4 separate times with a business attorney I hired for exactly this purpose. What I was permitted to do was describe what I was building in general terms to someone who asked me directly about alternatives. I was permitted to answer questions. I was permitted to give an honest professional opinion when asked for one. Glenn asked. We were finishing a quarterly call, just the 2 of us, and he said, "Sarah, I have to be straight with you. We're going to RFP this engagement when the contract comes up. Something needs to change with how we're structured." I asked him what he meant. He told me. And then I said, carefully, that I thought the model he was describing already existed in theory, and that I believed it was possible to build it in practice. He asked if I knew anyone who was doing it. I said I was working on something, but that I couldn't discuss it further while I was still with my current firm. He said, "When you can discuss it, call me first." That was all I needed. The morning I walked into my manager's office was not impulsive. I had been ready for 3 weeks, waiting for the right moment. When he called me in to inform me, with that rehearsed solemnity, that Marcus was being promoted to VP of Product Strategy, I already knew. I had known for 10 days. A colleague had told me in confidence. I had used those 10 days to confirm that every piece of my exit plan was locked, every document in order, every team member ready, every element of the Clarion launch prepared to move the moment I walked out of the building. Marcus had been at Pinnacle for 14 months. He was 32, had an impressive resume from a boutique firm in Boston, and possessed an almost supernatural ability to make other people's ideas sound like his own in meetings. My manager loved him. The senior partners loved him. He had a way of holding a room, of speaking with a kind of confident forward momentum that read as vision even when the substance underneath was thin. He was good. I don't want to suggest otherwise. But he had not spent 7 years building client relationships that represented nearly 40% of the firm's annual revenue. He had not developed the assessment methodology that 3 of our biggest accounts now relied on. He had not rebuilt the Hargrove engagement from near collapse 18 months ago, working 20-day stretches to make sure that relationship held. None of that appeared to matter. What mattered was that he had energy, that he had vision, that he connected with the partners in a way that apparently I did not. I had a fair idea of what that meant. He went to their golf events. He laughed at the right moments. He was building relationships upward with the same focused deliberateness that I had been applying to client outcomes, and in that particular game he was beating me decisively, so I stopped playing. My manager's name was David. By the time I left his office that morning, David was sitting behind his desk with an open folder in front of him, his prepared expression of professional sympathy completely dissolved. His assistant called me 4 times in the next 20 minutes. On the 5th call, I answered. "He wants to see you," she said carefully. "He said as soon as possible." "I have a 9:30, I told her. "I can be there at 10:15. There was a pause. He said now would be better. I arrived in 10:15. Not 9, not 5, 10. I had learned long ago that the timing of your entrance matters. Too fast and you look anxious. Too slow and you look insubordinate. 10 minutes communicated exactly what I intended. I'm not rattled, but I'm not dismissible either. The folder was open on his desk. He was standing when I walked in, which meant he was too agitated to sit. Marcus was not in the room. I noted that carefully. "What is this?" David said, holding up the Hargrove contract like it was something he'd found rather than something I'd given him. "That's a service agreement between Hargrove Technologies and Clarion Advisors," I said. "Glenn signed it yesterday." "Glenn, this is our client, Sarah. This is our campus account." "It was," I said. "Glenn has been looking for an outcomes-based engagement model for some time. I've built one. He's committed to a 2-year exclusive arrangement." David's face cycled through several expressions at once. Anger, disbelief, the beginning of something that might have been panic. You can't do this. This is direct client solicitation. My resignation is effective immediately under Section 9 of my employment agreement, I said, which addresses repeated promotional discrimination. Your legal team wrote that clause. I'd suggest reviewing it before making any formal claims. I watched comprehension land. As for client solicitation, I'd also suggest reviewing Section 12, which defines the conditions under which non-compete provisions are enforceable in this state. They're not, under these circumstances. My attorney has a memo prepared if that would be helpful. The color in his face shifted. He sat down. My files are organized and labeled, I continued. Everything is documented according to company protocol. Whoever takes over my accounts will find everything they need. I paused. For the accounts that stay. He looked up sharply. What does that mean? It means I'd focus your energy on client retention for the rest of the day, I said and stood to leave. Patricia had texted me before I reached the elevator. Conference room confirmed. 5 signed letters of intent ready to review. Don't stop for coffee, you'll be early anyway. I stopped for coffee. The afternoon meeting with my team, my actual team, the one I had spent 8 months building in my apartment and in borrowed conference rooms and over early morning calls, was quieter than I had imagined. There were no speeches, no champagne. We sat around a table in the co-working space I had been renting for 4 months, the temporary home of Clarion advisors, and we reviewed where we were. Hargrove signed 2 letters of intent from companies I had met at conferences over the past year, companies where I'd planted seeds carefully and waited. A third that Patricia had cultivated through her network. A fourth from a connection of Dominique's. The runway was tight but real. The model was sound. The work could begin. Pinnacle did not go quietly. Within the week we received a formal cease and desist letter claiming we had misappropriated proprietary methodologies. David, I later heard, had contacted at least 2 of our prospective clients personally and suggested we were facing imminent legal action. One of those prospects called me directly to ask. I sent him my attorney's memo, the one that outlined clearly and in specific detail why every element of our firm's founding was legally clean. He signed with us the following week. The first 3 months were the hardest. I am not going to pretend otherwise. We lost 2 prospects who didn't want to get caught in a legal dispute that didn't actually exist but that Pinnacle was doing its best to imply was real. One morning, I sat at my desk at 6:30 a.m., running projections on our remaining runway, and for the first time allowed myself to consider what it would mean if this didn't work. Not for me. I had savings. I had options. I could rebuild. But for Dominique, for James, for the others who had left stable positions because they believed in what I had told them was possible. That responsibility sat differently than any I had carried before. I went out to the small balcony off our office and stood in the cold for about 4 minutes. Then I went back inside and kept working. The turning point came from an unexpected direction. The Chicago Business Leadership Forum holds an annual half-day conference each spring, mostly attended by mid-market executives and the consulting firms trying to reach them. A colleague of Patricia's sat on the programming committee, and when a scheduled speaker withdrew 2 weeks before the event, Patricia made a call. I was given a 20-minute slot on a panel that had originally been about digital transformation but was now being repositioned around what the program listed as the evolving value question in professional services. I had 20 minutes and about 40 people in the room when I started. I had planned carefully, no jargon, no theory, just the math of why the traditional model failed clients and what a different model actually looked like in practice. I showed them numbers from our Hargrove engagement, real numbers, agreed to in advance with Glenn's team, growth metrics tied to the fees we'd earned, a direct line between what they had paid us and what they had gotten. By the time I finished, the room had nearly doubled. People had drifted in from adjacent sessions. The questions afterward were not polite or perfunctory. They were hungry. A woman in the front row who ran a mid-sized healthcare services company asked if she could schedule time the following week. A man near the back who introduced himself as head of operations at a manufacturing group said he had been looking for exactly this for 2 years and hadn't believed it existed. That presentation became the engine of everything that followed. We refined it, took it to 4 more industry events over the next 6 months, adapted it for different sectors. Not every conversation became a client, but enough did. We extended our runway. We hired 2 analysts. We moved to a larger space in the same building, a floor up, with windows on 2 sides and a conference room that fit 10 comfortably. Our model evolved through actual use in ways that theory hadn't fully anticipated. We developed tiered structures for companies at different stages. We created sector-specific metrics that made success measurable in terms clients actually cared about. Dominique built a client onboarding process that was more transparent and more responsive than anything I had seen at Pinnacle. James developed a diagnostic framework that we eventually licensed to 2 other firms that were trying to modernize their own practices and didn't know where to start. 11 months after I left, I attended the Midwest Growth Summit in Indianapolis. It was a 2-day conference, larger than the Chicago Forum, drawing executives and consulting professionals from across the region. I was scheduled to co-anchor a session on performance-based consulting structures. I arrived early on the second morning to review my notes over coffee in the hotel lobby, and when I looked up from my laptop, David was standing 8 feet away, holding a conference program and pretending to read it. We both registered the coincidence at the same moment. He recovered first, which surprised me. "Sarah," he said, crossing the distance between us with a practiced ease that almost passed for warmth. "I heard you might be presenting today." "David." I closed my laptop. "Are you enjoying the conference?" He glanced at the session guide. My name was on the cover. "Always useful to track where the industry is going," he said. He looked different, not diminished exactly, but leaner somehow, less settled in his authority. He wore a Pinnacle badge with a new tagline, "Value Forward Consulting," that I recognized as a response to the language Clarion had been putting into the market for the past year. Someone in their branding department had been paying attention. "I see you've updated the positioning," I said, nodding at the badge. He straightened slightly. "The market evolves. We evolve with it." I asked after Marcus. The pause before his answer was brief but visible. "Marcus has moved into a different role," he said, which from someone like David was as close to an admission as I was going to get. I later heard from a former colleague that Marcus had been quietly moved out of the VP position 8 months in when it became clear that managing actual client relationships required a different set of skills than managing upward. "I hope the transition has gone smoothly," I said, and meant it, more or less. There was a silence between us that wasn't entirely uncomfortable. Then David said, "Was it always this? Building the new model? Or was part of it about what happened with the promotion?" The question surprised me. It was more honest than I had expected from him, and it deserved an honest answer. "The promotion was the confirmation," I said, "not the cause. I already knew that what I wanted to build wasn't going to get built inside Pinnacle. That morning just removed the last reason to wait." He absorbed this, looked away for a moment, then back. "You've done something real here, Sarah. I want you to know I recognize that." It wasn't quite an apology. It wasn't nothing either. I nodded once and the conference organizer appeared at my elbow to move me toward the room, and that was the end of it. 1 year to the day from when I walked out of Pinnacle with a leather portfolio and a folder that changed everything, we gathered at the Clarion office on a Friday evening. The team had grown to 14 people. Our client list held 19 companies. Our revenue had cleared the projections Patricia had built in my apartment on a Thursday night, surrounded by takeout containers and yellow legal pads, and she had called those projections optimistic. I stood at the window that looks out over the West Loop, the old brick neighborhood that was exactly the opposite of Pinnacle's polished high-rise, and I thought about all the iterations of doubt I had carried through the last 12 months. The mornings of running runway numbers at 6 a.m., the afternoon I spent on the balcony in the cold telling myself that fear and recklessness are not the same thing. The night I called Patricia in a moment of genuine uncertainty and asked her whether I was building something real or just running away from something bad, and she said, "Sarah, those aren't mutually exclusive, and also it doesn't matter. The model works. Keep going." Dominique appeared beside me. She had a glass of sparkling water and the expression she gets when she's about to say something she's been holding for a while. "2 of our clients recommended us to their industry network this week," she said. Unprompted, just sent emails saying we were different and they should talk to us. That was the metric I hadn't known to put in the original projections. Not revenue, not client count, not analyst headcount. The moment clients started selling us to other clients without being asked, that was the moment the model proved itself in the only way that really mattered. I raised my glass to the room and said what I meant, without flourish. "Thank you for taking the risk with me. The glasses clinked, someone laughed at something James said, and the conversation picked up and spread across the room the way it does when people are genuinely glad to be where they are. Later, after most of the team had filtered out, Patricia and I sat in the conference room with cups of tea, the city lights coming through the tall factory windows. She looked at the room the way you look at something you helped build, and are quietly proud of. "You know what the difference was," she said, "between you and everyone else who had had this idea before you?" I waited. "You weren't trying to prove a point to anyone. You were trying to solve a problem." She set down her mug. "The people who do this because they want to win something, they usually get distracted the moment they start winning. You just kept building." I thought about David's question at the conference. Whether it was always about the model, or whether some part of it was about the promotion, about what I had been denied, about proving something to someone who had dismissed me. The honest answer, the one I hadn't said out loud to David because it was too layered for a hotel lobby conversation, was that both things were true and both things were fine. The anger was real. The ambition was real. The model was real. The model was real. They had all lived in me at the same time, and somewhere in the work of the past year, the anger had burned itself down to nothing, and what was left was just the work. The thing I had actually built. The thing that was actually changing how companies thought about what they were buying when they hired people like us. My manager had told me I lacked executive presence. I had turned that assessment over in my mind for months, searching it for the truth that sometimes hides inside criticism, trying to understand whether there was something I needed to hear. What I eventually concluded was that executive presence, as he used it, meant something specific and narrow, the ability to make the right people feel comfortable, to reflect back their own assumptions with enough energy that they read it as leadership. It was a real skill. I didn't have it and I wasn't going to develop it. What I had instead was something that turned out to be more durable. The ability to see a problem clearly, to design a solution for it, and to build the structures that made the solution real. That wasn't presence. That was just work, but it turned out to be enough. I locked up the Clarion office that night just after 10, took the elevator down through the old building, and walked out into the West Loop on a clear evening with the city lit up all around me. I had a 7:30 meeting in the morning with a company that had reached out after hearing about us from their industry association. I had notes to review, numbers to double-check, a presentation to tighten before I went to sleep. I was already thinking about tomorrow.